All right, let's dive into the world of warfare, specifically how it's changing, evolving. We've got this great article from Military Review, and
Military review. Oh, yeah.
yeah, it's a professional military journal published by the U.S. Army.
Okay. Yeah.
So this piece really digs into whether the way we think about warfare has kept up with, well, the actual reality on the ground.
I think that's a great question, actually.
Yeah, and it uses some really interesting examples. We're going to be talking about conflicts like Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and even going back and looking at figures like Napoleon.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a range.
Yeah, and the authors start with this really interesting argument.
Okay.
They say that, that classic picture of warfare, two nations going head to head, it's being challenged, right?
Yeah, I can
Well,
see that. I mean, just look at the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, right?
exactly. And those long wars we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan,
Yeah.
they really changed things.
Yeah, they do argue that pretty strongly.
And here's the thing that I thought was really fascinating. The authors claim that the U.S. was in Afghanistan for 8 years, like fully involved, without an actual comprehensive strategy.
Yeah.
Does that surprise you?
I mean, it gives you pause, right?
Yeah.
Because a clear strategy is, well, it's crucial, especially in those messy situations. I mean, imagine like
Yeah.
just throwing resources and military might at a problem without a clear sense of
Oh.
how are you going to measure success? What are you even aiming for?
What does victory even look like? Yeah.
Okay.
And the article really digs into how that lack of clarity played out in a bunch of conflicts, right? Post-Desert Storm.
Yeah, yeah. They use Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, they really,
As case studies
as
say.
case studies, really lay it out.
So let's talk about Kosovo,
Yeah.
right? The authors mention how the Serbs, they actually outsmarted NATO, even though NATO had this massive technological advantage.
Right. And, they were using things like, yeah, decoys, like fake tanks, these command posts that weren't really command posts.
Wow, that's
It
incredible.
really messed with NATO's targeting. They had these high-tech systems.
Right.
But the Serbs were adaptable. They were thinking outside the box.
That's amazing.
It shows that even in a high-tech war, you can't just rely on the tech, right? The human element, the ability to adapt and think creatively, that
You gotta be,
is still crucial.
yeah, so clever.
Yeah.
Then there's the whole thing about targeting civilian infrastructure. The article brings that up, both in Kosovo and Iraq.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right?
It seems like this.
Morally and strategically.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. Hitting key infrastructure can really hurt an enemy's ability to fight, but you alienate the population, you cause humanitarian crises, you might even be creating more problems than you're solving.
Yeah. You're fueling resentment, maybe even strengthening the very people you're fighting against.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Afghanistan. We were talking about the lack of a clear strategy initially, and the authors really focus on this, misunderstanding of the local dynamics, like tribal allegiances, all that.
It's so complex.
Yeah.
You can't just go in there with a cookie cutter approach. And, the story of Abdul Haq that really illustrates this.
Yeah, that was a powerful part of the article. Can you remind us who he was?
Of course. So Abdul Haq, he was an Afghan leader, opposed the Taliban, really tried to bring the Pashtun tribes together against them.
Yep.
And the U.S. saw him as a potential ally, but he was killed during a mission trying to get into Afghanistan.
All right, right.
And it was a huge loss, not just because of his leadership, but because it showed how not getting those tribal politics right, it could really undermine the entire mission.
It's a reminder that understanding the people, the culture, the politics, it's just as important as knowing the land, the terrain.
Absolutely. And this leads to something else the authors bring up, this idea of relying too much on technology.
They're not saying technology is bad.
No, not at all.
But it's like,
It's more that it can't replace strategic thinking.
right,
They
right.
connect this to the whole transformation thing. The Department of Defense under Rumsfeld really pushing for technological superiority. But the authors argue that this led to, well, a neglect of strategic thinking about the human side of war.
Okay, so how did this play out in Iraq? I mean, wasn't the whole point of precision bombing to minimize civilian casualties, like hitting very specific targets?
Yeah, that was the idea. But here's the thing. The authors suggest that by focusing so much on avoiding civilian casualties, it actually created this perception among some Iraqis that their country hadn't really suffered that much from the war.
So it's like a,
And this led some to, well, to question the legitimacy of their defeat.
that's wild.
It's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is, it is.
Trying to achieve this immaculate victory through technology, it can have unintended consequences. And it's here that they introduce this concept of people's war. It flips the script on traditional warfare.
And they use Napoleon in Russia, right?
Exactly. Napoleon invading Russia, 1812. It's the classic example of a seemingly unstoppable force being brought down, not just by the enemy army, but by the environment, by logistics, and most importantly, by the resistance of the people themselves.
So they're saying that winning hearts and minds, that's just as crucial, maybe even more so, than just achieving military objectives.
Absolutely. And this people's war idea, it becomes especially relevant when we look at places like Afghanistan, where the U.S. struggled to win over the local population.
Right.
And the authors are arguing that without that support, you're basically fighting an uphill battle no matter how good your technology is.
So you're constantly fighting new recruits, new resistance.
Exactly.
It never ends.
Yeah. And all of this leads to their call for a more holistic approach to strategy, something that goes beyond just the military side of things.
They talk about was it whole of government approach?
Whole of government. Yeah, they say we need to integrate the political stuff, the economic stuff, even the information side of things, alongside the military.
So it's not just about winning battles, it's about winning over the people, rebuilding economies, all these things together.
Exactly. It's about understanding that all these pieces are connected.
Yeah.
And that success requires a coordinated effort across all these different areas.
It's a lot more complicated than just, sending in the troops.
Yeah, a lot more.
Yeah, and it's about recognizing that every conflict has its own unique context. You can't just apply the same playbook over and over again.
You got to adapt,
You got to
be flexible.
Yeah, you got to tailor your approach. All right, so we've talked about this need for a more adaptable approach to strategy, but how do we actually do that? What steps can we take to make sure our strategies are effective in these complex conflicts?
Well, the authors point to a few key areas. First, they emphasize intelligence, like really deep, thorough intelligence gathering and analysis. But it's not just about collecting information, it's about understanding it.
So not just knowing what's happening, but why it's happening.
Exactly. What are the motivations? What are the capabilities? How might these different actors react?
Okay, so you're saying you can't develop a good strategy if you're working with bad information or if you just don't understand the situation.
Right. And, this kind of intelligence goes hand in hand with understanding the local culture, the politics, the economics. You can't just impose a solution from outside. You need to understand what's going on internally.
It's like you can't treat every patient with the same medicine. You have to diagnose the problem first.
I like that analogy. And this understanding is crucial for building relationships with the right people on the ground. Who holds influence? Who could be an ally? Who might try to block your goals?
So it's not just about military power. It's about knowing the political and social landscape.
Exactly. And this requires a shift in mindset, not just in the military, but across the entire government. Moving away from rigid doctrines and embracing flexibility, breaking down those silos between agencies and actually sharing information.
That sounds pretty challenging, especially given how bureaucratic governments can be.
It's definitely a challenge, but the authors argue it's essential. They call for a whole-of-government approach, where different agencies actually work together.
Can you give us an example? Like, what would that actually look like?
Okay, imagine we're trying to stabilize a region with an insurgency. A whole-of-government approach might involve the military providing security and training local forces. At the same time, the State Department is doing diplomacy, promoting good governance.
Right.
USAID is providing aid, supporting development projects, and the intelligence community is gathering information, analyzing the situation.
So it's about using all the tools in the toolbox at the same time.
Right, and recognizing that these elements are all connected. You can't just address one thing in isolation.
So whole of government makes sense in theory, but how do we actually make it happen?
Well, it takes strong leadership, right? The president, key cabinet members, they need to prioritize this kind of approach.
Okay, so it has to come from the top down.
Yeah, but it also requires a change in culture within those agencies. People need to be willing to work together, to share information.
Right, because sometimes it feels like those agencies are competing with each other more than they're cooperating.
And that's where public discourse comes in. The authors highlight how important that is in shaping effective strategies.
Why is public discourse so important?
Well, you need public support to sustain any long-term commitment, especially when it comes to military interventions.
So you're saying the public needs to understand the strategy, to be on board with it, for it to work in the long run.
Exactly. And that support comes from understanding and trust. The public needs to be informed about the objectives, the risks, the costs. They need to be part of the conversation.
But how do we make sure the conversation is meaningful? There's so much misinformation out there these days. It's hard to have a reasonable discussion about anything.
That's a real challenge, and the authors acknowledge that. They argue that we need to promote media literacy, critical thinking skills.
So helping people separate fact from fiction and engage in thoughtful discussion.
Exactly. It's about creating informed citizens, people who can critically evaluate information, engage in respectful debate, and hold their leaders accountable.
That's a big task, but it sounds important.
It is. It's the foundation for building the kind of public support that's essential for navigating these complex challenges.
All right, so we've talked about needing a nuanced understanding of the context, a whole-of-government approach, and a more informed public. What else can we do to make our strategies more adaptable and effective?
While the authors really stress continuous learning and adaptation, we can't cling to old doctrines or assume what worked before will work again.
So we need to constantly reassess, adjust based on what's happening.
Exactly. They talk about after-action review, carefully examine what happened, what worked, what didn't, and incorporate those lessons into the next plan.
So it's about admitting when things don't go as planned and learning from those mistakes.
Yeah, being open to change and improvement. And this is especially important with how fast technology changes and how sophisticated our adversaries are becoming.
So we need to be agile, innovative, always looking ahead.
Yeah, complacency is dangerous. The authors really emphasize that.
So the takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. You need to be flexible, adaptable, always evolving.
You got it. The battlefield is constantly changing. We need to be just as adaptable as our opponents, if not more so.
This has been a really eye-opening discussion. I'm seeing how these ideas about strategy and adaptability apply beyond the military. Like we were talking about climate change, the economy, all sorts of things.
That's a great point. These principles of strategic thinking, adaptability, continuous learning, they're relevant in so many areas of life.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, but I'm curious, what's the most important takeaway for you?
For me, it's the focus on the human element of conflict. Despite all the technology, it still comes down to people, their choices, their perceptions, their motivations.
That's a powerful reminder.
Yeah.
And it seems like understanding that human element is key to finding solutions that can actually create lasting peace.
Absolutely. We can't just rely on technology or simplistic solutions. We have to engage our minds, our empathy, our creativity to truly grasp these complex challenges.
It feels like we've been focusing a lot on the challenges and potential pitfalls of modern warfare.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about, well, what the authors propose as solutions. Like, where do we go from here? How do we actually build more effective strategies?
Yeah, they don't offer a simple roadmap,
Right.
which I think reflects the reality of things.
Yeah.
But they do highlight some guiding principles.
Okay.
One that really struck me is the need to move beyond a purely military view of conflict.
So stepping back from that idea that military might is always the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They argue for a more comprehensive approach, one that recognizes how political, economic, social, even informational factors all play a role.
It's not just about boots on the ground.
No, it's about understanding the root causes of instability
Okay.
and addressing those, not just reacting to the violence after it happens.
So it's about preventing conflict, not just
Yeah.
winning wars.
In a way. Yeah.
It's like, you can treat the symptoms of a disease, but if you don't address the underlying cause.
It's going to keep coming back.
Exactly.
And this requires us to think differently about the tools we use,
Yeah.
Diplomacy, development assistance, sanctions, strategic communication.
Not just the military.
Right. Sometimes the best solutions lie outside traditional warfare.
So how do we actually do that? How do we foster that kind of collaboration?
Well, they talk about the need for strong interagency coordination, creating structures and processes that allow different parts of the government to actually work together.
Share information.
Yeah, share information, coordinate their efforts.
So moving beyond those silos, that compartmentalization.
You're right, towards a more integrated approach.
That makes sense, but it also sounds really challenging.
It is. It definitely is.
How do we make it happen?
Well, strong leadership is crucial, setting the tone, empowering people.
Okay.
The authors talk about having clear objectives, defining roles and responsibilities.
Making sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly, a shared understanding of the strategy.
So you need a strong vision from the top.
Absolutely.
And this applies to the military as well, right?
Oh, definitely.
Like, what kind of leaders do we need?
They argue that we need military leaders who are more than just great tacticians.
Right.
They need to understand the political and social context.
So they need to be diplomats,
Yeah.
problem solvers.
Cultural ambassadors, even.
That's a lot to ask of one person.
It is.
How do we even find people like that?
Well, we need to rethink how we train and educate our military leaders.
Okay.
The authors suggest a more holistic approach to education,
Yeah.
going beyond just military doctrine, incorporating history, culture, politics, economics.
So a well-rounded education.
Yeah, one that prepares them for the complexities of the 21st century.
And this isn't just relevant for military leaders, is it?
No, not at all.
I mean, the world's getting more complex for everyone.
Yeah.
The ability to think strategically, to adapt, to work across cultures.
It's becoming essential no matter what you do.
I agree. So we talked about the need for a more nuanced understanding of the situation.
Yeah.
A whole-of-government approach and a more informed and engaged public.
Right.
What other steps can we take? What else can we do to make our strategies more adaptable and effective?
Well, they highlight the importance of continuous learning and adaptation.
Okay.
We can't afford to be stuck in the past.
Right.
We have to constantly reevaluate, adjust based on what's happening.
So being flexible,
Exactly.
open to change.
Yeah, they advocate for a culture of after-action review.
What's that?
Basically, you carefully examine the outcomes of your actions,
Okay.
identify what worked, what didn't, and then you use those lessons for future planning.
So learning from your mistakes.
Yeah, acknowledging that there's always room for improvement.
And this is especially important now with technology changing so rapidly
Right.
and our adversaries getting more sophisticated.
We need to be agile, innovative, always one step ahead.
Complacency is dangerous.
Absolutely.
So it's not about finding one perfect solution. It's about constantly evolving, adapting.
Yeah, the battlefield's always changing. We have to change with it.
This has been a really insightful discussion.
Yeah,
I'm seeing how these ideas apply beyond warfare.
absolutely.
It's about how we approach any complex challenge.
Yeah, climate change, the economy, you name it.
Out of all of this, what stood out to you as the most important takeaway?
I think it's the emphasis on the human element. Despite all the technology, warfare is still a human endeavor,
It's about people.
driven by choices, perceptions, motivations.
And understanding that is crucial for finding solutions that can actually lead to lasting peace.
Absolutely.
We can't just throw technology at the problem
Oh.
or rely on simplistic answers.
We have to engage our minds, our empathy, our creativity.
To really grasp these complex challenges.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the challenges of modern warfare, but I'm curious, what do the authors actually suggest we do about it? Like, how do we build those, more effective strategies?
Yeah, they don't give us a step-by-step plan,
Right.
which I think is kind of realistic.
Yeah, it's not that simple.
But they do offer some principles to think about.
Okay.
One that I found really interesting was the idea that we need to move beyond just a military-focused view of conflict.
So not just assuming that sending in troops is the answer.
Right, exactly.
No.
They're arguing for a more comprehensive approach, recognizing that political factors, economic factors, social, informational, all these things are intertwined.
It's all connected.
Yeah, and we need to understand the root causes of the instability, right?
So getting at the why.
The why, exactly.
Not just treating the symptoms.
Yeah, like you said earlier, treating the symptoms of a disease
Right.
doesn't actually cure the disease.
So how do we do that? How do we actually get at those root causes?
Well, it requires us to think creatively about all the tools we have.
Oh.
Not just military force,
Right.
but things like diplomacy, development assistance, economic sanctions, even how we communicate strategically.
Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a weapon at all.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how do we actually put that into practice? How do we get all these different actors working together?
Well, the authors really stress the importance of coordination,
Yep.
strong interagency coordination and communication.
Okay, so breaking down those silos.
Exactly, creating structures and processes that allow different parts of the government to work together, share information.
So it's about building a more integrated approach.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's easier said than done.
Right, absolutely.
Like, how do we actually make that happen?
Well, it requires strong leadership
Okay,
from the top,
okay.
setting a clear vision,
Right.
empowering the people involved.
So it has to start at the top.
It does, and the authors talk about the importance of clear objectives,
Right.
defining roles and responsibilities.
Making sure everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing.
Exactly, and that everyone understands the overall strategy.
Okay, so you need a strong leader to drive that process.
Absolutely.
And this applies to military leadership as well, right?
Oh, definitely.
Like, what qualities do military leaders need in this new world?
Well, the authors argue that they need to be more than just, skilled in military tactics and strategy.
Okay.
They also need a deep understanding of the political and social context.
So they need to be more than just warriors.
Yeah, they need to be diplomats, problem solvers.
Even cultural ambassadors?
Exactly. They need to be able to build relationships with local actors.
Understand the culture.
That's a lot to ask.
It is. How do we even find people like that?
Well, I think it starts with education.
Okay.
The authors advocate for a more holistic approach to military education,
Okay.
one that goes beyond traditional doctrine and tactics,
Right.
incorporating history, culture, politics, economics.
Wow. So it's really about creating a more well-rounded leader.
Exactly, preparing them for the complexities of the modern world.
And I think that applies to all of us, not just military leaders.
Absolutely. The world is getting more complex for everyone.
The ability to adapt, to think strategically,
Yeah.
to work across different cultures.
Those are essential skills no matter what you do.
I agree. Well, I think this deep dive has really given us a lot to consider. We've talked about how warfare is changing, the limitations of those traditional approaches,
Yeah.
and this need for more adaptable, nuanced strategies.
And I hope it's encouraged you to think critically about these issues and to engage in those conversations about the challenges we face.
Not just as a country, but as a global community.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
and I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been a really enlightening conversation.
It has.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
Definitely. And until next time, keep asking those questions, keep learning.
Keep engaging with the world.
Absolutely.
And that's a wrap for today's deep dive.